It's pretty clear from the reading in the previous chapter that Phyllis Day sees the years of Nixon, Ford, and Carter's presidency as an era of regression from the social welfare gains that were made in the Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations through the New Deal and the Great Society and the advances of civil rights movements. By the time Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, this backlash that was erupting because of economic problems, backlash against social welfare needs, it became very clear that the next decade was not going to be an era of friendly relations with social welfare programs. And in fact, there were some significant changes made in the government's role in social welfare program during the Reagan and the years of the first Bush administration that to this day we continue to deal with. In fact, you'll notice that many politicians today who want to be seen as conservative really hold Ronald Reagan up as sort of the paragon and as the supreme example of a good president. And while Reagan was popular in the 1980s, in fact, he raised taxes several times during his administration, even though he has the reputation for having not done so. And the national debt also skyrocketed during his administration. These are things that seem to be pushed aside today as we look back with the glow of history upon this era of time. The photograph in front of you, in fact, is the National AIDS quilt when it was first put together, or first began to be put together in the early 1980s. And the Reagan administration was infamous for ignoring the AIDS epidemic as it was developing just during those early years of its administration. At least the awareness of AIDS was developing during this period of time. The Surgeon General at the time, C. Everett Koop, began to press forward with a program of AIDS education, but the Reagan administration really ignored the needs of those victims during the administration. In fact, I believe it was said that Ronald Reagan never said the word AIDS once during his presidency. So while there was some hope under the Carter years that his sensitivity and awareness of poverty and having grown up in the South in the era of segregation, that he would somehow be able to bring us back to an interest in social welfare and civil rights, particularly given his interest in human rights around the world. Those hopes were dashed when he was not reelected and Reagan came into power. Reagan resolved much of the debate about social welfare with decisions against the interests of the poor. Phyllis Day believes that he really had a total lack of understanding of the needs of the poor and really was more focused upon making government smaller and getting government off the backs of people, as he would put it. His fiscal policy was used to decrease the size of federal government while at the same time increasing the money available to the wealthy to stimulate investments in the economy. His tax reform cut taxes for the rich, increased them for the working class. This is a rather familiar theme, I think, in the modern day. In fact, this is much the same kind of taxation theory, I believe, that the George W. Bush administration, the second Bush administration, used in the 8 years previous to Obama's administration, and is somewhat typical of the Republican approach to the economy. The results of these changes under the Reagan era was that little was done to stimulate increases in investments or in revenues to the federal government. He did believe that through cutting taxes to the wealthy that this would stimulate investments in the economy, but it just didn't happen that way. And there are years of large budget deficits that resulted. And primarily because of the focus of the federal government in decreasing the amount of output by the government for social programs and that type of thing, there was quite a large popular loss of support for social welfare programs. Reagan's economic theories were known as Reaganomics. In fact, his vice president was George H.W. Bush, which is the most recent President Bush's father. So for the 8 years of the Reagan administration, George H.W. Bush was the vice president, and Vice President Bush had run for president, challenged Reagan for the nomination in 1980 and referred to Reagan's economic plan as voodoo economics. So Bush Sr. seemed to have some sensitivity to the notion that supply-side economics could be useful at all. I mean, I think he understood that it didn't work exactly the way that Reagan proposed it would, and but nonetheless, once nominated or once picked as a vice presidential candidate, Bush became supportive of Reagan's theories and was a dutiful vice president throughout the administration. Didn't challenge the president at all in his theories, and very much like Hoover's programs, as this slide points out, Reagan's economic theories focused upon fiscal and economic policies that were based on supply side or trickle down economics. This is the idea again that we give money to the wealthy, we give money to the producers, and as they create jobs, as they invest that money in the economy, the benefits will trickle down to the masses, so to speak. And during his administration, remember now the government is, unlike in the Hoover administration, we have different things like the Council on Economic Advisors and some mechanisms now to basically manipulate different financial forces in the marketplace to assist the government in stabilizing the economy. And in this particular case, forces were brought to bear to allow the unemployment rate to rise during the Reagan administration, because what that did was it resulted in a decrease in inflation. Prices came down some, which eased some of the burden on the middle class and the upper class, but really didn't benefit the lower class whatsoever, or very little at least. So income accumulation concentrated at the top during this administration. And this would also include George Bush Sr.'s subsequent 4 years after Reagan left office. The growth in wealth in the top percentage of income is demonstrated through the wealthiest 6% of the United States citizens owning over half of the wealth, and when you took the top 16%, owned over 75% or over 3/4 of the wealth in the nation. Growth in the equality of wages, a further increase in the percentage of people living below the poverty line by 38% in the first 3 years of Reagan's administration. Just the first 3 years, the percentage of people living below the poverty level increased by 1/3. Social Security and state and local taxes remained regressive throughout this administration, and income tax became less progressive with changes in the tax laws during Reagan administration. Regressive and progressive taxes. Regressive taxes tax persons at a lower level at a greater amount than those taxed at a higher level. And the Social Security tax could be called a regressive tax because it is only paid by individuals up to a certain level of income, and I don't know what it is now, but it's something over $100,000. Once you have earned $100 and some thousand in income during the year, you don't pay Social Security tax after that. But most of us don't know that because most of us never reach that amount of income, but that is a fact. So the people that are earning the most money and really could be contributing quite a bit to the Social Security fund are not doing so because above $100 and some thousand a year of annual income, you no longer have to pay tax. So you can see where that's a bigger tax on those people earning less money, the middle class and the lower socioeconomic class. It's a larger tax. That's why they call it a regressive tax. Income tax, however, is in theory is a progressive tax because the rate that you pay your federal taxes are supposed to increase as your income goes up, your tax rate. Now, with different kinds of things done to the tax code during the Reagan administration and other administrations, including the Bush administration, those wealthy individuals actually pay a lower tax rate because there are certain things that they do with their money that we, in the lower end of the economical scale, couldn't afford to do. But they do that, like, making investments in buying stocks and, having offshore accounts and different kinds of things like that. And those investments are taxed at a lower rate than income is. And so even though the income tax is set up to be a progressive tax, in fact, it isn't because of all the loopholes that are put in place for the wealthy individuals to take advantage of the tax laws and thus reduce their taxes. So during the Reagan administration, changes to the tax laws made the income tax less progressive through some of the addition of some of those loopholes and things like that. So really, as you can see, the economic policies in this administration certainly favored those with more wealth. Reagan called his program a new federalism, and there were really two primary pieces to his approach, to his push during his administration. One was the reprivatization of the care of the poor. He really wanted to kind of turn the care of poverty programs, anti-poverty programs and things like that, over to the charitable organizations and voluntary organizations rather than depending upon the government for this. And the second piece was to shift the costs of welfare programs to the states from the federal government. He believed that it was a state responsibility according to the Constitution, kind of hearkening back to the days of Franklin Pierce in the 1840s, I think. The federal government really had no place in providing for the needy in his theories. And as is noted here in this slide, his attempts to shift some of the costs to the states, or to shift the entire responsibility of welfare programs to the states, was voted down by Congress. In 1981, which would be the first year of Reagan's administration, Congress passed the Omnibus Reconciliation Act, or OBRA, and this was one of the linchpins of the Reagan approach to dealing with social service programs. And the OBRA Act created social service block grants. So rather than the federal government providing money for a certain program at a certain rate and providing money for another program at a certain rate, instead what they were doing was they were just giving the states a certain amount of money and saying this is what you get for social services, at least in many areas of social services. And so the concept was then the states had more control over this money and could decide what they wanted to do. After, if you remember in the previous chapter, we talked about the federalization of SSI, for instance, where the federal government took some responsibility to equalize the income of individuals around the nation, recognizing that some states provided poorer benefits than others. The Reagan administration seemed to take this in the other direction, giving the states once again more authority to determine just how much somebody got in their state. And so with the social service block grants, there were other features of this that really hurt the recipient. One was that the block grant, OBRA, removed the requirement of a 25% match from the states for federal dollars for social services. Prior to that time, if the federal government provided $100, the states had to provide another $25. So, or if the states would, I'm sorry, let me rephrase it. The federal government would pay $75 of every $100, and the states would contribute $25. That's called a 25% match. So the state budgets had to contribute money towards social services in order to earn the federal the federal monies for certain social service programs. OBRA removed that 25% match. Furthermore, the funding that was made available in the social service block grants during the Reagan administration also decreased 20 to 25%. So really you were looking at a real decrease of about half of the money available for social services in some of the states during the Reagan administration. In addition to this, the Omnibus Reconciliation Act also allowed for-profit agencies to compete for social service funding. So the for-profit agency thus implied that a certain amount of that money could go for profits than for the owner. So this redirected even more federal funds away from client populations. Most of the agencies that receive government grants are not-for-profit agencies, and they have to account for the money. If there's excess money earned, more than if they wind up with a budget surplus at the end of the fiscal year, that money has to be reinvested in the agency itself. It isn't something that the owners or the individuals who run the agency can take home as profit. In a for-profit venture, of course, they can do that. And so the OBRA, I guess, in an attempt to encourage the growth of the economy, allowed for-profit agencies to step into the social service field. H. Ross Perot, who ran for president in, I believe, 1992, made a lot of his money in Texas, in fact, in running an agency that I believe that agency administered the AFDC program in the state of Texas, if I'm not mistaken. Made quite a bit of money doing that. I was working in the social service field during this era, dating myself now, and I can tell you that during the course of the Reagan administration, particularly the first term, there was a lot of anxiety about what was going to happen to the social programs that we were working in, because the message was pretty clear that there were going to be cuts. The Supreme Court was becoming more conservative in addition to that, and would likely be supportive of changes in the Reagan administration. And a lot of the conservatives in the Congress came forward during this period of time to begin to propose more controls and more cuts to funding for these programs. So during this period of time, you saw things occurring like the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program saw eligibility rules tightened. Unemployment benefits dropped, and here are some figures you can see in 1976, and this would have been at the end of the Gerald Ford administration. There was 7.6 million people unemployed, and about 31 billion in federal benefits were paid in unemployment compensation to those individuals. In 1982, when they were, and this would have been the second year of the Reagan administration, unemployment had increased by 25%, it looks like, or 33%, I guess, if you're doing your math correctly, up to 10 million, and yet the benefits being paid out were reduced to less than 24 billion, so it decreased by just about as much. The benefits paid decreased about the same percentage as the individuals drawing those benefits increased. The food stamp eligibility rules were tightened. Funding for school lunches and the Women's Infant and Children program reduced. WIC is a program that provides basic nutritional foods, dairy products and things like that to pregnant women and to women with young children who are qualified at a certain income level, and it's considered to be a very important program for nutrition and development of young children who live in underprivileged socioeconomic classes. And so funding for school lunches and WIC was reduced. It was, by the way, during the Reagan administration that ketchup became defined as a vegetable for the purposes of a balanced school lunch. You'd be interested in knowing. This is also the same president that said that trees were responsible for pollution. So anyway, I'm off track here. And also the CETA program, which we had talked about earlier, the job training program from the previous chapter, was replaced by the Job Training Partnership Act, JTPA. But among other things, the JTPA, one of the changes, difference between CETA and JTPA was that JTPA does not have any specific requirement to target the underprivileged for those job training programs. So again, the focus was taken away from the needy in many of the kinds of things that occurred in this new federalism focus. Government welfare expenditures in 1988, which would have been the last year of the Reagan administration, looked like this. Social insurance and government retirement programs, and this is basically, we're talking about Social Security. These are things that, the middle class generally do not consider to be welfare because we earn this, quote unquote, earn it through our contributions and our earnings over the years. So Social Security and government retirement programs essentially were about 50% of the income, or rather the expenditures in Reagan's program in his last year. Education was around, I believe, 25% is what that's supposed to show. That's not a very good graph. And programs for the poor, under 14%. So the means tested programs, AFDC, food stamps, Medicaid, those types of things, really were the smallest percentage of government welfare expenditures in 1988. But now think about this, when we talk about cutting welfare, the only little bar that we're talking about is the programs for the poor. We really don't talk about cutting education or really talk about cutting Social Security. We may be talking about changing Social Security in this day and age, but not cutting it out. So this is an illustration of just the fact that there's a lot of focus placed upon that, the smallest bar in this chart, that 14% or so. There was a step backwards in terms of, well, at least many people would consider it a step backwards in terms of civil rights during the Reagan administration. The United States Supreme Court in the Bakke versus the Regents of University of California in 1978. Actually, I take this back. This was not the Reagan administration. This was the last years of the Carter administration. The Supreme Court indicated Bakke wanted to be a medical student at the University of California and was not admitted, and charged reverse discrimination because he learned that he was denied admission to medical school even though his grades were higher than some minority applicants who were admitted. This is sort of the constant complaint about and the belief that this is what affirmative action does, and this is not typical of affirmative action, at least not the many different types of affirmative action. When an organization or an agency or a university strictly sticks to the quota system, which says that if there are 12% blacks in the population, then 12% of our admissions will be African American, then yes, this can happen. But affirmative action is much, much more than simply this quota system. And in fact, the Supreme Court essentially, while it ruled in favor of Bakke and said that he should be admitted, it upheld the university's right to reserve slots for minority students. But it essentially said that the use of the quota system, as I understand this at least, was really not lawful. And so there are other ways that affirmative action goes to work on behalf of minority applicants that are lawful and that may give some extra attention, even some preference perhaps, to minority applications, but do not exclude Caucasians from being hired. And this is one of the keys to legal affirmative action. Essentially says that it's okay to put in special efforts to recruit minority applications and to do extra outreach to encourage minority applicants, but those efforts cannot be made so that white people are excluded from opportunity to fill those positions and be hired. And so this is a key thing. Affirmative action, legal affirmative action, cannot exclude individuals in the majority from being selected for a position or for a slot at a university or something like this. And this is one of these things that people, when they rail about affirmative action, they say, well, I can't get a job because I'm white. And that's not true. Not anymore. So just keep that in mind as that subject comes up in years ahead. But in any event, this was one of the first blows against affirmative action. Mind you, the courts continue to really chip away at affirmative action programs, but this certainly did a lot to accelerate the trend away from equity for minorities. And then another big force or factor politically during this period of time was the emergence of the religious right in the political scene. We've had the television evangelists on TV for years and years and years, but suddenly these individuals have now become a force politically. I think partly with the expansion of cable and I don't think we had satellite television quite then, but those kinds of the expansion of television stations that were available and who could get on the airwaves now is no longer limited to the main networks. And so televangelists became much more powerful and became very politically involved and found, I think, a kindred soul in Ronald Reagan. Or maybe the other way around is maybe Reagan saw that this was a way to get a big block of votes in his favor. The new morality emerged during Reagan's administration, exercising political powers, and these beliefs of the new morality reinforced a lot of beliefs that essentially undermined efforts to eliminate discrimination against sex, class, and race, or using sex, class, and race discrimination, and really reinforced discrimination in those areas. And the new morality, the religious right, once again placed a focus upon work in a society where routine tasks were now automated and production was enhanced. And so at a time when work becomes less and less necessary, political belief begins to equate work with morality once again and makes it even more difficult for individuals who are unemployed and out of work. President George W. Bush II, also, as you may recall, really connected very strongly with the religious right as well, and this was a major force in some of the policies in his administration, and we'll talk about that in another couple of weeks. In 1988, the Family Support Act, this is towards the end of the Reagan administration, was created, but it reflected a distaste for what was referred to, what they referred to as the inappropriate lifestyle of the poor, the popular belief that the poor individuals lived immoral lives, and some of that was reflected in some of the other readings that you have done for this class. So the states were required to establish paternity in AFDC cases. Mothers are requiring to cooperate in identifying fathers, including going to court if necessary, at the risk of losing their benefits if they don't cooperate fully. And sometimes mothers have reasons for not wanting to bring the father into the picture, perhaps in abusive situations, but this program really focused upon mothers being required to identify the father, and the effort here was, of course, to ensure that the fathers were paying child support. This is when the whole term of the deadbeat dad, I think, developed during this era, in fact. And so the intent was to ensure that men were responsible for supporting children that they created, but the upshot of this was, if the men couldn't be found, which was often the case, the mother could be penalized for that if she didn't cooperate in trying to help find them. The JOBS program, and JOBS stands for something that I'm sorry, I've lost it. I don't know what it stands for, but the JOBS program was established also to ensure that AFTC families established work habits at the risk of sanction for non-compliance as well. This sort of took place of the place of the work incentive program, I believe, that we had talked about in the previous era. Just new guidelines and new expectations in terms of getting to work or getting job training. And as the last point here in this slide, there were some states, and Alaska was included in this, that approved post-secondary education for recipients so that taking college classes could be considered work hours, more or less, and I believe funding was made available for college education, so this was not an entirely all negative kind of a thing. But although, again, you understand, we're trying to eliminate poverty by making people work, and we already know that our economy can't support everybody working. Important point here, that why do these programs not work? Putting people to work is just one piece of this, and eliminating poverty, just one piece. But this is as far as most of our programs want to go. We just want to blame the unemployed person for their poverty. The social work profession, Phyllis Day will tell you that she's really clearly disappointed with what has happened in the social work profession in terms of philosophy in relation to programs for the poor. And perhaps rightfully so. She believes that the social work professionals during this period of time backed away from the empowerment activities that became more prominent during the radical social work we were talking about in the 60s, perhaps into the 70s, and instead moved to focus upon helping clients fit in better, moving more towards that medical model, private practice, therapy kind of focus in their work. And during this period of time, like others in our history that we have studied in the last 100 years or so, any kind of disagreement with traditionalism, with the focus on American values and in following along with what the government said, and hard work and individualism and those kinds of things, any disagreement with that, any lifestyle outside the norm of the two-parent families with two children, really were viewed as deviant, un-American, malcontented, and so it really wasn't safe to be in the opposition, so to speak, during these years. And so Phyllis Day really sums up, doesn't really give a whole lot of attention to George H.W. Bush as much as she does to Ronald Reagan, and there's a reason for that, because it was referred to as the Reagan Revolution, which really kind of changed many things during that period of time. Reagan was seen as a conservative leader when, in fact, as Phyllis Day points out, he was much more of a reactionary. He wasn't really so much about reclaiming traditional American values as it was about reclaiming the capitalist system and participating in the backlash against the New Deal. And to be pointed out that Reagan, in his younger years, actually was quite the New Deal person. But it seems to me that as he began to accumulate more wealth in Hollywood, and he was an actor, he became more sensitive to the fact that government was taking a lot of taxes away from persons who were working real hard, and moved from being a Democrat to Republican. George H.W. Bush, however, was a Republican all his life and came by his wealth pretty honestly. I mean, his father was a United States senator, in fact, and the Bush family fortune was tied up in diplomacy and oil, kind of a combination of the two. When George H.W. Bush was elected president in his own right in 1988, his administration really worked to solidify the Reagan approach to domestic issues. There really wasn't a lot of difference, and in fact, one of the reasons that I believe that George H.W. Bush was defeated for his second term had a lot to do with the fact that he had no clear domestic agenda of his own. He was very big on foreign policy, but not really on domestic policy at all. And so, as Day says, this set the stage for a society where politicians believe cutbacks in social programs and laissez-faire civil rights are the appropriate way of conducting a country. Despite his rhetoric, he took his cues from the legacy of the Reagan-Bush years: workfare, time-limited public assistance, and personal responsibility for failure. She says the moral degradation of society appeared likely to continue well into the next century. And with that, we'll close this particular segment of discussion on social welfare programs, and I'll talk to you again in another week.